You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens.
Aaron Terrell is a transgender man from the United States who transitioned in 2011 at the age of 27. He's a founding member of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance and is a co-host of the organization's podcast, which is called Transparency. The organization and podcast both seek to educate about gender dysphoria from the perspectives of those who experience it, but without the sacred or fundamentalist tones that are often applied to the topic of transition. In recent years, Aaron has become curious about the factors that contribute to female dysphoria and the desire to transition, and he's especially interested in transition as a cultural phenomenon. Here's our conversation with Aaron. Hi, Stella. How are you today?
Hi, Sasha. I've been better, but I'm still standing, and I'm very excited about our guest today. Should be very interesting
Aaron.
Conversation.
Yes.
Hello,
Hi,
Sasha. Hello,
Aaron.
Stella. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Aaron, for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
So we have been kind of interacting a little bit online. I've been following you on Twitter for some time, and I assume you have as well, Stella. And we're just really thrilled to have you here because you've been talking a lot about your experiences as a trans person. You transitioned as an adult. And you've really called attention to a lot of the problems you see going on with childhood dysphoria and how that's being treated and conceptualized. So we're just really grateful to have your perspective here today. So could you maybe start off for any listeners who aren't familiar with your experiences and your story? Can you just start off by telling us a little bit about your experience with dysphoria and transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So I transitioned in 2011. I was 27 years old, so an adult, young adult, but certainly past the age of 25, right? That's the the concerning bit. I had dysphoria, what I would now call dysphoria, from as long as I can remember, just this nagging, just real discomfort with having been a girl and feeling like I was supposed to be a boy. It's very similar to what Stella has described in her own past, except mine wasn't even that bad, honestly. The only difference is as I got older, it got worse rather than relenting. But as a child, it was like something that it was upsetting and frustrating and confusing, but it wasn't. It didn't cause any serious mental turmoil for me. I guess I don't have much to compare it with. But anyway, and I always assumed I would outgrow it. I just assumed, by puberty, that's kind of what I latched onto. Was at puberty, I would, my body would develop in such a way that I could no longer pretend I was a boy. It would become inescapable. And you hear all this. I grew up in a very conservative Christian environment, and there was very strict gender roles, and it was really kind of put into my brain that puberty would make me into a woman. Like it's really like this kind of sacred stage of development. And I actually believe that. Like I believe that for that reason, puberty would take away that should have been a boy kind of feeling. It didn't. And then another thing is it actually set in quite late. So I didn't experience puberty, start menstruating or anything like that until I was 14. And at which point I assumed, or because it took so long to get there, I kept thinking I was right all along. I'm not actually really a girl. The longer it got away, the more it was cemented. But then, obviously it did happen. It didn't take away those feelings, and they only got worse. And then the older I got, the more embarrassing it was that I was still kind of retreating to be alone, to kind of live out this fantasy of being, of being male. Like, it's hard to explain because it felt very, very childish, very Secret Life of Walter Mitty, just, living in my head, more than in reality where I could be male. But yeah, and then so 27, I encountered the possibility of transition. In that case, it does have a lot of overlap with rapid onset gender dysphoria. Is that I could always live my life and compartmentalize it until I encountered, whoa, this is here. This is available. It's not that difficult. This is all I have to do. This step, this step, this step. And at that point, it was a absolute not a compulsion, an obsession. Like I couldn't compartmentalize it. This is what I must do. And yeah, I did it, and I transitioned. It was a pretty immediate success. Dysphoria feelings went away pretty much immediately after top surgery. I had so much contentment and just this profound discomfort I always lived with, which I couldn't really ever imagine not living with, was gone. And so obviously testosterone helped a bit, but those two things put together, is why, I'm kind of rambling here, but I feel like it's important to point out that while at this point, I don't believe that transitioning to appear as the opposite sex is an appropriate solution for a mental health issue. It did basically eradicate my dysphoria about 95%. And I was able to live my life quite successfully as a man. I went back to school and got a bachelor's degree. I'd only finished an AA prior, and then just sort of lived my life as male until about so that was about 5 years, I want to say, that I was doing that. And then back in 2017 is kind of when I clued into the massive boom in transitioning, and just in a kind of a cultural understanding of transition as like this certain type of person is a trans person. And that I kind of took offense to, is like, no, I'm just a man. I was always meant to be a man. I now am a man. And you're telling me that I'm just this part of this subgroup, this queer, cool thing. I was kind of offended by that. And then so the more I looked into kind of the cultural shift, I realized, wow, dysphoria isn't one thing. What I've experienced and all these other people have experienced that led them to this place is very different depending on who you're talking to. And it's certainly between males and females. And I just kind of got wrapped up in, why do we do this? Where do these feelings come from? And yeah, it made me kind of second guess everything that I had taken for granted for the last 5-6 years.
Could I ask, that was really, it wasn't rambling, it was fascinating, it really was. When did you discover, you said you transitioned to 2011, when did you discover the concept of transition? You kind of ran over that quickly, and I was going to jump in, but I was really interested in what you were saying next, so I didn't.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was aware of trans people via things like Jerry Springer and stuff like that in the 90s, right? But it was like this eccentric, weird third category of person, typically male to female. And it was like, I'm not that. I was just supposed to be a boy. Like, I was supposed to be male. I'm not this third thing.
I was the exact same. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
I'm not one of that. No way. That was never even an option in my brain. It was like, no, that's Jerry Springer. But right. I should have been a boy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Very clear.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay,
and when did you discovered the idea of transition as an easy concept? I think you said 2010 or something. I'm not sure what year you said.
I think it was 2010. It was 2011 that I started testosterone. But I think it was in 2011 was when I there was somebody had started working at my same office who was who I kind of clocked as a female to male transitioner, and it was like this is something in my real life. Like, this is somebody who lives in the same city as me. He's got a job, found out later he had a fiance, and like, it was like, this is a real and really? So I started looking online, it's like, transitioning, and whatnot, and realized how easy it was, and how accessible it was. So it was around 2010, because again, until that point, it just seemed like such a foreign concept that really could never be plausible to me. And then also I would be this third thing in that.
Me too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then 2017, if I'm right, you kind of said, oh, wait, there's a whole thing going on here. So you were out, you weren't in that world at all, really.
No.
You were just doing your own thing.
Yeah. So around 2010, 2011, I kind of got enmeshed in the forums and stuff like that, seeking out resources for transition and whatnot, and befriended a few other female to male transitioners, across the globe. But mostly it was like kind of like sharing experiences and resources and advice and stuff. And then, but then once I transitioned, I kind of put it all behind me. I didn't think that much about it, and I didn't spend much time in online communities for trans people. I certainly didn't think that there were other trans people other than that one guy that I previously worked with, who he and I were, we didn't spend much time together, but maintained a certain, Facebook era, style friendship. But I didn't really think that there were many trans people around me. And then in 2017, I actually met and I met and befriended a few trans men, or one trans man, who introduced me to a whole bunch of others in the city, because this is a college town. So now that I know of the boom, it seems obvious that there were, it's a very liberal, college city, but it just seemed kind of, it didn't occur to me that there were other trans men in my city. So I befriended him, met a few others in that same social circle. And so at first it was like really cool. Like these are people that I can have, really intense, really, very shared circumstances, experiences, and I was very excited about it at first. And then everything was about trans for them. Everything. Everything was about, pronouns and who's cis and who's, what. It was just very, everything was about being, and it made me really uncomfortable. And there was also talking about, I talk about, like, oh, what was dysphoria like for you, or how did, to transition, fix it? And they're like, well, I never had dysphoria. And I'm like, well, then why did you transition? And the actual response I got was, so people would know I'm trans. Like really, really, like, of course that's why, I would transition. And I was like, this was a 25-year-old person. This was not a kid. And I got, and so I was, my initial reaction was kind of alarm and being offended by it. But then, so the more people I spoke to in that same social circle, it was the exact same understanding. And I was the weird one for pathologizing, transness. And I'd never heard that term before, transness. I heard that too. And so I went online and I started looking about, just like kind of re-immersed myself in online trans communities, and I realized I was the weird one. This is the normal way of conceptualizing this right now, and I couldn't be offended. Like, there's no way to be offended by that when you see it. It's like this is colossally, like, this is bad territory we are in right now. So
that's so interesting, because like prior to 2017, you were just kind of like doing your own thing, existing in your own bubble in a way.
Yeah, I had all my same normie friends that I had, pre-transition. Yeah. Like, yeah, it wasn't something I was aware of. Yeah.
And so you probably, like you said, initially you thought, oh, meeting all these trans guys, this is going to be so cool because we're going to have so many shared experiences. And you discovered actually that they all had a lot of similarities in the way they conceptualize their bodies, their identity, what it means to be trans, what dysphoria, whether it's necessary or not. And then you were all of a sudden the outlier. And I find that really interesting. It's like almost a parallel of what you probably felt as a kid with your dysphoria, feeling like I'm an outlier. Why do I feel these things? And then you find yourself amongst who you imagine to be like a peer group. And you're like, what? I don't fit in here at all.
Yeah. I wouldn't have drawn that parallel, but you're right. Yeah, it's actually correct. Yes.
I want to ask you about your childhood. I mean, you described these really complex feelings about your body, and you said it was similar to Stella's, and I know in Stella's story, everybody around knew how Stella felt, especially as a child, because she announced it all the time. Did people in your life, parents, adults, kids at school, did they realize that you were having this struggle, or was this very internal and personal? Because you talked about, like, once you got your period, you'd still kind of wanted to hide away and try to live out this fantasy. And you even admonished yourself a little bit for what you called like childlike. But I'm wondering, was this just a personal internal struggle, or was this pretty obvious to anyone who knew you?
I wonder how obvious it was. I definitely kept it to myself. I didn't tell anyone. I was very ashamed of it from as early as I could remember. Because I remember, so like Stella's upbringing, it sounds like, she was allowed to just be really, really, just behave like a boy and even kind of express
really
that she was one. Yeah, well, yeah. I was to an extent. It was like allowed to play like I was always playing cowboys and just being my friends were all boys. I had an older brother. Having an older brother, I wonder how much if that's kind of the root. It's like I was mirroring him. Maybe that's where some of the dysphoria set in. I've wondered, but
me too. So I had an older brother. Yeah.
I wonder if there is like a connection of mirroring that's yeah, but I didn't. There were things that I'd done from a very early age, like my brother telling me, I only learned about this a few years ago, that I used to insist on peeing standing up, and then I would pee all down in my pants, obviously. And there were things that I did that were like external clues, I guess, but I wasn't telling anybody about it. So there were, I'm having many conversations with my mom where she's saying, you're a girl. This is how girls behave. This is how girls dress. God made you a girl. God doesn't make mistakes. And so I don't know what things I was saying or doing that led to those conversations. I just remember having a lot of those conversations and feeling very ashamed. And kind of like retreating and just being alone where, like I was again when I was playing with the boys, I imagined I was one of them, like I was just one of the boys. Until there were things that happened where it would knock me back. It's like, no, you're really a girl, and that's where the kind of dissonance comes in, I guess. And so the older I got, the less I could just be one of the boys, and the more kind of isolation.
Yeah, that was like kind of my follow-up question, because you talked about how in your family of origin, there was like really rigid gender roles and it was a very religious community. So, whenever I meet individuals who have experienced some kind of distress around gender and they grew up in really restrictive gender role environments, that's always something that comes up in my mind. Like, I always get curious, had you been fully just affirmed for however you chose to be. Now, obviously, if you insisted that you were a boy or thought you were a boy, you probably would have been like corrected through, the avenues of adult interaction. But had you not had that rigid type of expectation around what girls are supposed to do and what girls are supposed to like, I do wonder if that would have lessened your dysphoria. Like, sometimes I wonder if dysphoria is a product of both the sex dysphoria and also the kind of gender role imposition.
I definitely think you're right. I think for me, when something becomes shameful, it becomes a secret, and it kind of solidifies, and so I think that kind of enmeshed it into my brain. But what I think also happens is when you say like so. That kind of internal dysphoria that's more like I should have been this way. It doesn't exist as sex dysphoria initially. I think it becomes sex dysphoria when your body is a constant reflection of what it's like. It's a contradiction. Your body's just contradicting what you believe should be reflected, and that becomes dysphoria at the sexed body. Whereas I don't think it would be if you weren't being told that having this body means you should feel this way and do this thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's a huge distinction. So you're kind of saying that it's the pairing of female body means you should have this personality that actually exacerbates and creates this kind of disconnection with the biological sex, in your case.
Yes, I believe so. Yes. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay, so you fast forward to 2017 and you realize that a lot of these kind of contemporary trans men have a really different experience and perspective. And I've heard you in other conversations talk about the parallel between like your religious upbringing and some of the current beliefs inside of trans ideology and trans activism. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Well, it's so culturally constructed is what I see. There's norms of behaviors, and there's so in my upbringing, we could talk about anything that wasn't, you didn't question the word of God. That just is, right? And you couldn't, so there was, I understood from a very young age basically what blasphemy was, and I was very conscious of not committing it, right? Very much like, even in your own head, because God can hear it, God can detect it. So when I got re-immersed, I became an atheist in my early 20s, right? And was, very Christopher Hitchens style atheist, really kind of, no, this is actually very, very detrimental. And then I sort of kind of got, I think, just sort of culturally got wrapped up in a bit of the trans stuff before it was really in my face with other people. Cause like when you're in that environment, there are things that you don't commit the blasphemy of misgendering. You don't, there are these kind of these rules that are very, very clearly, akin to religion, especially this notion that there's basically, an extreme, there's righteousness in ignoring what you see with your own eyes. Like there's righteousness in believing what is contradictory to what you're seeing. And so like the more, so if you got a lumberjack who goes by they, them, it's like the quicker you can get on board, the purer you are,
Yeah.
Whoa.
That was big in Ireland, and somebody would say, oh, they have great faith. And it basically meant they could believe black as white. That's how great their faith was. They've great faith. So did you see parallels with that, or were you very comfortable in that? Do you understand? Did you think, this is like my religious upbringing? Or did you think, oh, I know these waters and I'm actually very comfortable and rock on?
The latter, actually. So quite subconsciously though, right? I didn't identify it as such, right? I just like, you kind of go, oh yeah, I can demonstrate how good I am and how on board I am with, which what I've now kind of come to realize is basically queer theory framework of understanding, people and, so it was very easy to kind of just knee jerk go, oh yeah, she's, a male who rides Harley Davidsons and has a wife, but that is totally a lesbian, like saying something like that felt like it just felt like a demonstration of moral purity. That you totally get it. But it was all very abstract.
And sorry, can I also say that it also means you're like somehow above your instincts?
Yes.
Which is common to both religion and this kind of trans thing.
Yeah, and you're transcendent. Like you've got the faith. You don't even need physical evidence. You're way beyond that.
I think what it is we have this instinct to kind of elevate ourselves above the rest of the mammal kingdom. And like, so if we're not tied to like the rest of the rules that govern animal life, we are now with the saints. And I think religion does that. And now this latest religion of gender certainly does that. It separates us from biological life.
Okay, so keep going. Really so you were saying, you felt comfortable demonstrating your quick ability to get on board, to recognize the pronouns and the identity, and then what? Keep going.
Well, so part of why that felt so comfortable is because I knew what I had always felt, and I knew what was now called gender dysphoria, and I knew that transition drastically fixed it. So I was very gung-ho. Just like if you believe that somebody's, soul can live forever in heaven if you abide by these certain rules. And, there's that kind of parallel as well, where it's like, this is a solution. So it's not just falling into the culture of it, the religious culture of it, but it is like, it very much felt like this saved me, just like, just like religion saved, but so where I was initially coming from is I assumed gender dysphoria was one thing, whether this was a 45-year-old man or male or a, 13-year-old girl. I thought they all had the same experience that I did. I thought that when we say dysphoria, we all meant one thing, or even if we say trans, we all meant one thing. And then when I started it took meeting people in real life and spending time with them and understanding that no, we don't all mean the same thing when we say dysphoria. And oftentimes trans doesn't even mean, when I say dysphoria, I mean like a deep discomfort with one's natal sex. Let's say that, right? So I assumed that was a common experience, and all we have to do societally to relieve that is to respect pronouns and yada yada. And it seemed like such a small imposition for how much relief it had provided me, right? And so I wanted to provide that to anyone else as well. And so it was about 2017 is when I started realizing this is not all one thing. And when you also kind of, just like when you snap out of a religion, you can kind of see the harmful behaviors therein. So the same thing when I kind of got jerked out of the genderology stuff is like you see the great harm that's being done, especially when we're talking about teenage girls, and the immense, just how physically invasive the response to this, what I've come to like identify as kind of like a religious subculture is trans, that everybody on the clinical side of it is treating it like just any other medical well, not even that, it's all been swept up in this weird culty stuff, but I don't know where I was going with that so much, is like when you kind of snap out of it and see that this isn't just solving a deep hurt in people and making their lives easier, but really these people are making their lives much more difficult as a means of like a temporary state of the need for personal differentiation, and it just when you finally clue in and see that, you can't not see it, and I couldn't not be quiet about it.
But you've jumped ahead because because you were right in the faith there. So could you tell me, how did you get jerked out, if you follow me? Because you were right in there, and you were kind of the best Christian for a little while. Yeah.
It was so. I guess it wasn't that big of a part of my life. Like, so I believed it. I believed the whole gender stuff. But it wasn't something I was enmeshed in, right? Because like I was doing a degree in geography. It wasn't like a very this was in, let's say, 2011 to 2016, right? So there wasn't, the gender stuff hadn't really enmeshed in the culture like it has now. I mean, it was there, but it was quite fringe, and so I wasn't really interacting with it on a day-to-day basis. So it was just when I would go on these forums or these, it was like I would be right there with the people who I saw as living the same life as me and wanting to support them. And, when we abide by these rules and provide each other with support and whatnot in the very, again, it wasn't even all that often that I was in these virtual spaces. So I guess it was when I was enmeshed in it in real life, when I met those young trans men in my city, that I realized that's what snapped me out of it. Like it wasn't like I was in lockstep with them for a little while. It was like when I was presented with this in real life is when I realized how
was there a moment or anything? Was there a day or was there an event or anything that made you think, hang on, what's going on?
I think it was that when so there was stuff that I kind of like just glossed over, like this is just a cultural misunderstanding, this is just a new way of framing that I don't really understand. But it was that moment when I was talking about because that trans man that I befriended that I mentioned, he had top surgery, and I remember I was explaining to him how just taking for granted the fact that he had felt about his chest the way I had felt about mine. And so I was saying, how abhorrent they felt on me, and how like I was always mentally sound, but they were getting to points where it's like I was like contemplating like not seriously logically but like thoughts of self-mutilation. It's like this will rid me of this. But I was not going to do. I knew that I would bleed to death and die, or like it wasn't really something I was consciously entertaining. But it was like that's where your brain goes with that discomfort. And I remember talking to him about that, and he sounded completely disgusted, like just abhorred by the thought. And I was like, "What did it feel like for you, like dysphoria?" And he was like, "Well, I never had any problem with my chest." And I was like, "Well, then why did you have top surgery?" And he said, "So people would know I am trans." In that way, and that was when it was just like, holy, this is other territory. So I mean, now obviously I've kind of slapped out of it, and I think back and I was like, not only do, like, I wonder, obviously, large scale is like treating dysphoria, a mental discomfort with one's body, with irreversible surgeries. Ethically, I don't think that's correct. That's the kind of shaky ground I'm on here, though, is I know for whatever reason it worked for me. It relieved that distress, but I feel like there should have been other ways around that, right? Again, I'm not talking about like malpractice at all. I'm happy with where I'm at, but now ethically, I feel like we really shouldn't get to that point where we are, physically altering people's bodies in the direction of the opposite sex to relieve that dysphoria. But that's not where I was at when I was having these conversations. And what I heard was like an appropriation of just the gravest sort, but then also with catastrophic ramifications. We talk a lot about cultural appropriation, or appropriation of any kind, and I think like usually that's harming the culture or the person it's being appropriated from. But this is very much the opposite. The people who are like I said, transitioning to be trans is like, I can't be offended by that because they are doing, like, severe harm is being done to what are otherwise just kids looking for, not kids, and a lot of times these are young adults, and actually adults who are looking for kind of a culture, a culture to belong to, a kind of a certain I think so much of this is loneliness. I keep going back to that. The same thing that drives people to religions is driving people, to cults and whatnot, is like this need for community and a sense of belonging, a sense of personhood, that's both distinct and collective. And this provides that. And
I think you're right. It's a post-religion age we're in, and there's been so much anxiety and so much kind of clinging on to things. It feels very much part of it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what really stands out is that when you decided to embark on the transition process, it was literally the sole purpose of transition was an attempt at a solution for a real problem you had. Whereas you started to meet people who were transitioning almost as a rites of passage into a kind of club. And that is... It is kind of a creepy, like I'm thinking of like a Stepford Wives kind of situation where you like end up somewhere and you realize, holy crap, like everybody here has taken the same vows, has like pledged to do the same things to their bodies. There's something really group conformist about how you started to meet people and hear everybody's stories, and you realize there's something vastly different about your experience and how you ended up transitioning versus these other individuals and why they decided to transition.
Right. And it wasn't so. Again, at first, I thought that was just that this was just a niche group of people I happened upon. And then when I went on,
guys,
and then when I went online and realized it was pretty pervasive, is when I realized I couldn't keep quiet. I had to start talking about this stuff. Yeah.
So then what happened? Did you just say, I'm going to make an online account and start writing, or how did you kind of get into the whole world of like heterodox views? And then of course I want to talk about your Substack and your podcast, but you went from being kind of shocked by what you were hearing to launching yourself somehow into these discussions.
So I went on Twitter. First I heard, I realized this was kind of all around me in every trans circle I went into, and then I got on Twitter, and and I happened upon Buck Angel being interviewed on a podcast called Transbra, which was hosted by my now friend Mars Fernandez, and I'm sure you guys are all familiar with you, and also his friend Alec at the time, and they were having these conversations that I was like, oh, okay, so there's still some people who see this the way that I do, as like a breath of fresh air kind of sanity, and then so I kind of got enmeshed in the gender critical trans kind of conversation on Twitter. The Substack came a while later. Mostly I was just sort of talking and listening, and I didn't really expect to have any sort of platform. I was just kind of speaking my mind and wanting to be kind of part of the conversation that was kind of shedding light on this stuff. And then the more time I spent, and again, I was kind of coming from that like true scum type, I still believed that there was, that I had this real thing that was gender dysphoria, and that transition is the solution for it. So I still believed that when I first kind of got enmeshed in it. And then obviously then as I'm more exposed to kind of, gender critical perspectives is when I realized this is not, sure, we can say gender dysphoria is a real thing, but it's more, it's like any sort of other anxiety, or I'm kind of rambling. So there isn't really a direct trajectory of when. I guess there is. I guess when J.K. Rowling wrote that letter,
really?
Turf Wars, and the media response to that I realized like this is. So I thought it was like a niche issue that was trans that had been engulfed by this kind of cult-like mind frame. And that's what I thought I was fighting an internal war, And then when we saw the mainstream response to J.K. Rowling, I was like, this is mainstream. Like this is all pervasive.
Rowling.
And
what's
that?
J.K. Rowling, you couldn't get more mainstream. Yeah.
And
yeah. It's funny because you kept encountering situations where you're like, this is a fringe. There's no way this is like bigger than this. And then like you kept stepping it up the ladder and realizing this is huge.
You weren't big on social media. That was my kind of almost only conclusion here.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't at all until about 2017, 2018, when I kind of got wind of this stuff. And that's kind of what my social media has been tailored around ever since. But I wasn't really in social media at the time that these arguments first started. I was very much offline.
So your views, have obviously evolved a lot. And it's interesting because it's so ironic because you were largely helped by transition. And yet you have also been really forthcoming in like your blog, for example, talking about some of the complicated parts of your life that you now think back on and just wonder about. Not that negates the helpfulness that transition has offered you, but is it okay if I read something particular from your Substack? Just a short thing. Okay, so you said, from my earliest memories, the wish to be a boy, or the self-conception of myself as a boy, was inextricable from my sense of shame at feeling that way. I began to tell myself stories to explain why I felt the way I did. When I was a toddler, my infant brother died from SIDS. A few years later, I became convinced that his spirit had passed into me. That was why I felt I was a boy. I was carrying my brother's spirit within me. This story also gave me permission to act like a boy because I was doing it for my brother, not for me. That is a really powerful example of the fact that children, when dealing with grief, have very complicated reactions and create all kinds of mechanisms to try and deal with their grief or keep their beloved sibling alive. Like this is actually a very common experience of young people who are bereaved by a baby sibling.
See, I didn't know that it was a common experience. I didn't. Because it wasn't really a bereavement for me in that I don't have any recollection of him whatsoever. I was 18 months old when he died, and I have no recollection of him. But he was my mom was obviously completely devastated. I mean, as any parent, mother would be. And he was spoken about all the time. Like, he was just sort of a fixture of the family. And so I wasn't experiencing any gender issues at that age, at 18, when I was a toddler. I didn't even have a concept of him. Just growing up, there was this conversation about my little brother who died when I was 18 months old.
So maybe it was like an attempt to give your parents back something.
It could be. I remember being a very selfish experience, or not a selfish, but a very self-centered. Like, it was very much me. Why do I feel this way? Okay, I feel this way because, it was like I was grasping for an explanation. So I don't remember having any feelings, and they could have been subconscious, but I don't remember having any feelings of wanting to recreate or bring him back for my parents. I remember it being very much like just an explanation for myself.
Yeah, I remember I've worked with clients with exactly that, siblings of babies, and I've studied quite a lot, and I think it's a very, very impactful experience for the child. I know it is for the parents, but for the child, for the siblings, I think obviously you're growing up shrouded in grief, but there's often a very big kind of, it's lovely. I can see, I don't know if there's any way around it, but like often, like you've described, that there's a determination to keep the baby alive as such in all our minds. And that impacts the siblings very differently to the parents. The parents have got the concept of what they're doing. The siblings, I think, are kind of lost in guilt, survivor guilt of, I'm alive and maybe he should have been alive. I don't know. And I need to make sure people are happy because I don't, just an awful lot of complex emotions. And I would say survivor guilt is the strongest of that I think it's a really difficult road for siblings. I really do.
It's all, yeah. I just remember it being a constant. I don't remember, my feelings about it. I remember hearing stories about that I had reached into his crib and squeezed his hand. And so I remember that feeling an element of guilt around that, but I don't know if that's like my brain kind of trying to funnel the guilt in a certain direction. But
you've been very, again, kind of like honest in your current assessment of, for you, what your gender dysphoria experiences have meant. And it seems like you've kind of looked back and thought about a lot of different iterations of like what you think about transition. There was a period of time where you're obviously describing that, hey, this solved my problem for the most part, and it worked really well. And I've also heard you say, I don't think this should be a first line of defense, medically speaking, when people have dysphoria. So can you share, like, how have your views on transition evolved? And does that go in parallel with the fact that the population doesn't all have your same experience? That a lot of these young people seem to be just like adopting a belief system. Like, I suspect that the more we recognize that, the less we should lean on transition as a first line of defense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the reason why I've been talking so kind of, openly about my own experience is because I feel like this is all being facilitated by a shroud of misunderstanding and kind of obfuscation around what dysphoria is or what trans is. So that's the reason behind my excessive oversharing all the time is because it's like, just shed some light here. This doesn't have to be a mystery. But so yes, you're absolutely right in that if I had gone online and encountered everybody mirroring my own experiences back to me, I would have been like, okay, yep, this was exactly what I needed to do. I was right all along. This is the one thing. Transition is what we should do. But when you hear these very, very different experiences, and you start to realize this, we're treating a broad variety of like social anxieties or body issues with one specific invasive solution, and we're treating it like it's this sacred thing. So yes, you're right, Sasha. I think if I had encountered everybody saying the same thing that I felt, I would have been like, yep, it was perfectly correct.
And would it have been any harm had you transitioned 10 years? What would have happened if you transitioned 10 or 15 years earlier, do you think? You know what I mean? Because I know you're against childhood transition, but I also know that you've transitioned and you feel it suited you. So the elephant in the room is, well, what is the harm? Now, I say that, and I am not pro childhood transition, but I'd like to just explore it.
Well, because I would not have ever known that. So if I had transitioned in my teens, or even younger, there's no way for me to have known that I wouldn't outgrow it. It's also when you're a teenager, you're full of all sorts of insecurities, and certainly a teenage girl, is body dysmorphia is sort of par for the course of growing up. So I know that I didn't outgrow it. I also wonder, although, again, when I encountered this as, even in, at 27, there was still an ROGD type response in me that I became obsessive and fixated. And whereas that wasn't the case before for me, I was able to compartmentalize and live my life without any major mental health issues. So yes, there are people whose lives are dramatically improved by this. Mine was. But I don't know that. Yeah, there's no way for a teenager to know that. There's no way that children aren't going to grow up having been interfered with, having their course of development, their puberty interfered with at a time when those are normal parts of development that kind of put that take you in the direction of a fully formed adult. And if you step in and interfere with that physically, cognitively, socially, it's a strange kind of adolescent engineering that cannot be undone. And I don't know why. Yeah.
And do you think there was any other roads available to you?
Thinking back, no. I mean, well, had I been given maybe a gender critical perspective at that same time, at 27, there's plenty of. See, I was never able to use the word woman to describe myself. No matter how old I got, it sounded like a foreign, weird thing. It just sounded so bizarre and incorrect. So I wonder. So when I think back, and I think if I were presented with kind of this radical gender critical notion that your body is basically doesn't inform anything about you or how you live your life. It's I still could never get behind feminist ideals and whatnot because it seemed like those were for women. I was never one of them, so I do wonder because I try to put myself back in that mind frame of what would have interrupted that thought process that fell entirely on transition. And I keep going back to those kind of, gender critical philosophies. But again, I never could conceptualize myself as if I belonged in the category of woman anyway. So I don't know if it would have ever gotten through to me. And then also with the inundation of transition, even if I hadn't, gone down that road in 2010, 2011, it would have been absolutely inescapable with the direction, culturally we've gone into. So come 2015, 2016, when it's, all in your face, I definitely couldn't have avoided it then. There's no way that I could have, put it off because it was only got
you feel it was coming. You feel you were going to do it at some point.
So again, I was able to deal with it internally, compartmentalizing it and not transition until it was presented to me externally, right? So
Yeah.
what I mean is even, if I had gone off the grid at that point, I could have continued to compartmentalize it and not, not that was really on the cards, but you know what I mean? The trans in the culture has just gotten more and more and more intense.
Yeah.
So there's no way. So I think, okay, if I hadn't transitioned in 2011, 2012, there's no way I'd be sitting here today still not have transitioned because of just how. And
was there any kind of, for me, there was a lot of internalized misogyny, I believe.
Yeah.
Was there for you?
I think so. Only the last couple of years I've figured that out, but I absolutely believe so. remember growing up in a very conservative environment, where I was supposed to be a wife and a mother, and I couldn't conceptualize that at all. It was very much like the man is a breadwinner, and there was very rigid gender roles too. And I could never, my mom and I are very, very different people. I never related with her. I related much better with my dad. There were just a lot of things that I think made the category of womanhood feel like a foreign territory for me. So I think, I think what was presented to me of womanhood externally I did interpret that with what we would call internalized misogyny. Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff that I want to ask you about. I mean, I want to just briefly go back to what you were just discussing, which is the idea that it was almost inevitable for you to transition because the concept of transition just existed in the ether of culture. And I've heard clients who are, let's say they're struggling with gender dysphoria and they're not sure they want to transition, but like I've heard clients talk about feeling gripped and possessed by the idea of it. And like I've heard clients say, I wish I had never heard that transition existed, because now that I know it exists, it's really hard to like imagine not going down that road. And it's kind of like what I hear you saying. You even described it as an obsession initially. So there's something about the possibility of having something so drastically different that reminds me of a lot of things. Like I can imagine that if somebody, and I don't want to say this is along the same lines, but if somebody's in a miserable marriage and they're not aware that there's such a thing as divorce, they're not going to think about it. They're just going to like drudge through the misery of that marriage. But if you learn that there's such a thing and you start researching it and you contact a lawyer who does it, and it becomes a possibility, just like you meeting that trans guy a long time ago, you're like, oh my God, this is an actual possibility. So there's something very powerful about that. And I'm not saying that's either good or bad, but it's just really noteworthy that having that within your purview of what's feasible changes everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's, because, it is, so again, going back, it's difficult for me because it did relieve so much. I feel for those people who are detransitioned or who transition just didn't provide the relief. And now like they look back and they go, that idea had captivated me in such a way that there was really no way around going down that route, or it was very difficult to not allow yourself to go down that route. But yeah, for me, it did, it was such a relief. It was, so I think that's why it took me, a very introspective kind of person. It took me a long time to think back on my transition critically because it worked so well. But now that I kind of see the harm that it's doing more broadly, I obviously have to turn that lens back on me. It's like when I first transitioned, I started using the men's facilities, no questions asked. I didn't have a moral dilemma in my head about it. It just seemed like this is where I should be as a man, right? And so when people were, when you get the what I now know as, the pushback that a lot of women are having towards trans women, using their facilities. So at first when I heard that, I had that same reaction. It's like, oh, that's just bigotry. They're just transphobes, And then when you explore that issue from their perspective, it's like, no, this is a very, very valid, reasonable concern and a boundary that should be maintained. So I had to put that back on myself as well. It's like, no, I don't really cause any harm to males in those facilities I'm using. Least of all without them, knowing that I am female. But it's still, the ethical question still remains. And so I had to reflect on that. And where I landed is like, I still use men's bathrooms because I'm much less of a cause for concern in the men's bathrooms versus me using the women's bathrooms. That would not be appropriate. But I don't use men's locker rooms anymore, like changing facilities. That's not a necessity. So I don't use them.
So what do you use?
Well, I would like if I would go to the gym, I change at home. Yeah, change and shower at home.
That seems hard on you.
It's not. I mean, especially honestly, Stella, I came to this conclusion during COVID, so I haven't yet to. This is a recent ethical.
But well done, conceptually.
Ethics of this particular.
I theoretically sacrificed myself here.
And you know what? It works on paper.
But
just could we pause on that for a second? Yeah. Because I don't believe we have come to any sort of resolution. And I think you're a very good example of that issue. And, for all the shouting and all the kind of social, cultural wars that are going on online, the resolutions aren't being teased out because people are being silenced. And, I don't think that's a good enough solution for you. And so I think, well, now we have a problem societally, and we need to confront that and kind of grapple with that. I think that's where discussions, thankfully we're discussing it freely here, but I think that's where we've got to kind of come around to this issue. I personally, I'm all for the third space, if you follow me, so that there's a female, a male and a mixed. Do you know what I mean? Because, for example, I wouldn't just say for you, for example, let's say when my husband, we had the kids and he could never change their nappies, all the stuff about like when they were, and he couldn't, you know what I mean? It was always the nappy changing was often in the ladies. And then later on, let's say trying to go swimming, and let's say my girl would be 5 and he's like, do I bring her into the men's? Or do I let her go into the girls on her own when she's 5 and just go swimming? What the hell? And now I know there's a lot of family rooms, but I don't know. There's a lot really that's kind of very not really figured out.
I have a lot of thoughts on the facilities issue, and first of all, I don't think we'll ever solve it. I don't think we will, because for so many, the bathroom issue isn't about accessing these services so much as they are public validation of an identity. So a lot of people are going to be opposed to the idea of a third space because it's otherizing them. It's not allowing them into the category that they have sought to be. So there's going to be resistance to that third space option.
Could there? Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say economically. Also, it seems like not many people are going to want to.
I just wonder, could there be pride in trans like in the future? Do you between 2011 and 2017? Did you wear it as trans? I think you wore it as I'm a man, as opposed to I'm trans. Could there be pride in the future of I'm trans? That's what I am, and that's a proud and noble position to take in the world.
Absolutely, for female to male transitioners, I think that's entirely thing, and it actually, I think it has a lot of draw for a lot of young females. Certainly, is to be there is a lot of pride in being trans, and I think there's also kind of culturally there's even a certain level of appreciation for it. That doesn't extend to the female to male or the male to female transitioners, and because a lot of that perspective is entirely 100% for 24/7 validation of womanhood is that drive. Whereas I don't think so. For me, yes, I wanted to live and exist as a man. I wasn't ashamed of being female at all. I was uncomfortable by it, but I wasn't ashamed of it. And acknowledging the fact that I was female didn't shatter an internal fantasy I had to maintain, where it seems for a lot of male to female transitioners, that's the case. There can't be anything that kind of interrupts that concept of the self as a woman.
No reminders.
No. Mm-hmm. Can't have it. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the third spaces wouldn't work out. It's like, yes, for some of us, we can find, I know when I first started transitioning, I did have pride in it. I was like, this is something I'm able to do. I kind of embraced it. But then as soon as I basically started passing, it was like, throwing that aside, I'm just a man, right? And so, and then once I realized, wow, we've got some really ethically and medically dangerous territory we're getting into, I re-embraced that trans identification.
What's wrong with trans? Why can't people just be trans? Like, I'm trans. It's I know it's not what they want, but geez, there's a lot of things we don't want, and yet we've got to accept. God, I could give you a long list of what I don't want about myself.
Right. Yeah, but it's just like this one thing we're allowed to. Yeah.
I think two things really contribute. I think, Aaron, you're kind of pointing to the type of motivation that often sits behind male to female transition being perhaps autogynephilia, which we have to cover on this show, which we really have danced around but haven't gotten to. And so I think you're right that there's this fantasy that cannot be shattered by a fully accepting self of like, yes, I'm trans and I'm going to own that. Like, that's one thing. And then I think there's a second piece here, which is that there's a kind of belief system that includes such slogans as trans women are women. And also there are probably trans men who are bought into that kind of belief system that see it as an insult to have to say, well, I'm going to use a third space. Like, no, if I identify as a man, then I am a man, and therefore I need that identity to be validated. So I think between the compulsion behind some MTF transition and this like new belief system, there's going to be a lot of pushback against the third space. Though, Stella, I get what you're saying, and I'm all about like people fully embracing who they are, even if they fit kind of outside of this typical gender thing. But I think for a lot of people, those defenses are very powerful.
Yeah, and I think why I think it won't be solved is I think maybe we could have a cultural conversation that where we're able to compromise in this third space option, but I honestly think that we are going to wake up from this before that happens. I don't think that might sound really kind of
Matrixy.
I was going to say controversial. What's up?
Optimistic?
Yes. I honestly think within about 5 to 10 years, we are going to snap out of it. We're going to realize what we've done to children. And I just, again, this might sound, I'm going in a dark direction here, but I don't think we're going to progress to continuing to culturally facilitate transition when all the chips fall on the vast amount of harm that's being done. So I think that's going to happen long before facilities catch up to our current, where we're at currently, I guess. Yeah. There's no point to updating infrastructure when all of this has come crashing down is what I see, I guess. Again, dark, but also
even
optimistic.
Though it's dark. I mean, what do you think will happen? I mean, when you say the chips are going to fall, I mean, Stella and I both say we think this is a medical scandal. I mean, we've been pretty explicit about this. Not transition in general, but specifically pushing childhood transition with no safeguarding mechanisms. But what do you think the fallout is going to look like?
I think we are approaching a tsunami of detransitioners, mostly vulnerable young women who have been harmed by. I think it was even J.K. Rowling who referred to it as basically a fad religion, medical negligence. So there's going to be lawsuits. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know. I think we're all sort of in this cultish trance. It's like a lot of people outside of it don't know that that's what's going on, and they just think. So one thing that I keep going back to is most of this I think is facilitated by a conflation between trans and gay. And so people externally just see trans as the new gay, and only a bigot would not, affirm these kids and affirm these people and validate their gender identity, because we don't want to be homophobes again. We don't want to go down that route. And so much is in that basket, that conflation basket. And people don't look too closely. And so, but once the detransitioners start, these numbers are going to exponentially increase, and people will have to look at it for what it actually is.
They might even keep going. Sorry,
which is what we've been doing is we've been taking perfectly healthy bodies and cosmetically altering them in the direction of the opposite sex. It's completely bizarre. If you just think about what we're doing, it's absolutely bizarre. But for some people with certain extreme mental turmoil about their sex, it for whatever reason it works. But it seems to be just a very bizarre way to handle it. And I feel like eventually we're going to wake up to it, and it's going to be the detransitioners who wake us up to it. Is what I predict, and it's going to be within the next 5 to 10 years.
And you know the way they say gay is, or trans is the new gay, and people think that. I think there's going to be an argument that people will be saying, actually, when we look at the arc of, anorexia and then bulimia and then self-harm, they're going to see that ROGD was on that arc, if you follow me. That it's the new body loathing. You know what I mean? It's not, and I'm talking about specifically ROGD as opposed to people who consistently want to trans.
But I just think there's so much overlap in between what we categorize as like the different types of dysphoria. I know for me there was a lot of overlap. Like we talk about how there's the HSTS, right? And that even this apparently affects females, where it's like just like these young girls who are really uncomfortable with their bodies. They're very, very masculine. They're going to grow up to be lesbians. Both Stella and I had very severe childhood, or Stella more so, severe gender dysphoria, and grew up to be heterosexual. Like this isn't there isn't and then there's the ROGD thing, which again I had very much traits of when I transitioned. I probably also could potentially I've spectrum traits that like there's just certain things that I see, kind of little bits of everything that kind of lead to the destination that is transition. And it's not as neat as certainly in females, it's not as neat as we like to present with these little dysphoria categorizations. And mostly it's social, and it's very, very often not related to sexual orientation. It's a kind of social anxiety for the most part. There's so much vagary around what is transition, and associating it with homosexuality just seems really like not really. It's missing the mark, I think. Certainly in females, yeah.
Yeah, I think the concept creep issue really comes into play here, and what we understand as being gender distress has really broadened to encompass such a broad range of individuals, which you kind of alluded to earlier, Aaron. Like there's a broad range of people who want to change their body for a variety of reasons, and they're all being kind of gobbled up by this question of gender transition, when really we're talking about such a disparate set of kind of presenting problems and conditions and experiences. So I think you're right. And we do see that medical scandals happen when we apply a very particular medical solution to like a broad range of the population with no assessment to see if it's the right fit for them. And I think that's exactly what's happening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love your lobotomy comparisons that you've done. It's like, the same thing. It's like we're solving very, vague, nebulous, mental issues with a very extreme physical intervention. And I think we're going to look back at this with far more. Sorry, I'm getting dark. I'm going to stop on my dark trains of thoughts. Yeah.
Well, in terms of like positive things, I mean, I would say the Gender Dysphoria Alliance is a really great. Can you talk a little bit about that as we wrap up our conversation? Yeah.
So Aaron Kimberly founded Gender Dysphoria Alliance Canada, which was meant to just tell stories of individuals with gender dysphoria, and kind of show what that looks like without the kind of the kind of weird sacred propaganda stuff that we attribute to trans and transition stuff now.
It's and then gender dysphoria without the religion.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Just separate the religion, and just here we have this mental condition. But so Aaron and I connected just on that basis of wanting to be open and honest about what gender dysphoria is, or at least for us, and what we see, reflected, and just kind of wanting to investigate these details and tell stories of adults with gender dysphoria, and do so very, very transparently. And that's actually the name of the podcast we started as well, where we just talk to other adults with gender dysphoria or professionals, such as yourselves. We'd love to have you on. Obviously, we've talked about that, with understanding of gender dysphoria. So that, it's called transparency. But the whole point is just to educate about gender dysphoria, to advocate for more evidence-based, reasonable, rational, not institutionally captured healthcare, and just do what we can as trans adults to shed light.
Well, I hope that our listeners will check out the podcast if they haven't already. It's really great. You have a very good interview with Mars, which I've referenced in some other conversations, and several very interesting interviews. Actually, you guys interviewed Lisa Shoup, formerly Jamie Shoup, who Stella and I talked about in our non-binary episode. So for updates on Lisa Shoup, that's a great interview to check out as well.
Yes. Now actually James Shoup. So it's a recent update of a few days. We that interview with at the time Lisa, technically James Shoup, he talks about his experience with autogynephilia very openly, very candidly. He did so as well again with Benjamin Boyce just a week or so ago. I definitely recommend everybody check that out, because that is some really, really valuable insight into that facet of male to female transition. Yeah. Much respect.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for coming on. This was such a lovely conversation, and definitely we'd love to join you on the podcast with Aaron Kay. So
awesome.
we'll make sure that happens.
Thank you so much for having me. This will be great.
Very important.
I love what you guys are doing.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens. This podcast is partially sponsored by RIME, Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics. RIME is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
If you found value in our show, please review us on iTunes and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Just go to our link tree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.